Hi. Hope everyone is doing well. I hope the noise is okay. I'm sitting on my porch out back. It's a rainy day, kind of bleak, miserable, but life is pretty good. My family continues to be safe and healthy, and that's the most important thing that we have. And I hope that the same can be said for all of you. I'd like to continue discussing American presidents of the past through the filter of Donald Trump, and to make some comparisons and contrasts where appropriate. So today's topic will be Bill Clinton. Um, they're very different people, and when I make comparisons and think there's similarities, please don't think I'm equating the two. I don't think Bill Clinton is anything at all like Donald Trump, even though there are some similarities. For instance, um, I think it's safe to say that both Trump and Clinton were sexual predators. There's no other way to say it. Trump has been very open about it, bragged about it. That horrific clip that came out during the 2016 election, where he bragged where he could grab any woman's privates because he's a celebrity and get away with it. The lawsuits, et cetera, the accusations, and his supporters brush it off. I'm not sure why. Uh, Read a lot about this. There are some who want to argue that Trump has managed to portray himself as the president in recent history who's most loved America. Personally, I think many of his supporters or quasi-supporters see Trump as a means to an end. I want to protect my Second Amendment rights. I want to try and end abortion. I want to try and get prayer in school. I want lower taxes. I want tax cuts. And so they've made this deal that they think he can deliver. And clearly the Republican Party as a whole, especially members of Congress, have bought into this deal. It's allowed them to stay in power. It's allowed them to change the balance of the judiciary system. The Senate has confirmed hundreds of very conservative judges to the courts. And so the accusations of being a sexual predator um, doesn't matter to some people. Bill Clinton was a sexual predator. I don't think there's any other way to say it again. He admitted to having inappropriate sexual goings on in the Oval Office with an intern. It led to his impeachment. We'll talk more about that. There were accusations before that. For instance, I'm going to toggle between pages so I can keep my facts straight. The most famous of them was Paula Jones. Um, she was a former Arkansas State employee. She sued Clinton for sexual harassment. Um, the case led to Ken Starr being named independent counsel. The investigation it was meant to broaden the ongoing investigation of Clinton's pre-presidency financial dealings with the Whitewater Land Company. We'll talk a little bit about that too. Jones filed a suit in civil court. Clinton was ordered by the court to testify, which he did, which led to his "I did not have sex with that woman" statement, which was not true. And he famously said, "Depends on what you mean by sex," et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There were other women also who accused him. And at the time, his supporters also turned a blind eye. But here I think is the big difference. Everybody turned a blind eye back then. Doesn't make it right. Didn't justify any of their actions. But men in position of power has gotten away with that. I mean, John Kennedy was perhaps the worst example. He slept with anything that had a skirt. And the media knew about it. They just reported about it. By the time Clinton's president, people were reporting about it. And I think people compartmentalize. Um, and the case in point is that had Clinton been able to run for third office, he would have been reelected. His popularity was very, very high at the end of his presidency. So that's one point of similarity. As an aside, I just want to say, and maybe we'll touch on it, the current complaints of Republicans, particularly the president, court filings, claiming that he has absolute immunity to such things while he's president, but also bringing up the notion of presidential harassment to allow such cases or subpoenas to go forward is laughable. It's hypocritical. Clinton got subpoenaed. Clinton had to appear before a grand jury. Clinton had to produce documents, and his White House functioned as White Houses should. He had a legal team working on it. He didn't put himself above the law. So Republicans talking about presidential harassment, we'll see. Clinton was harassed perhaps as no president in modern time was harassed. That's the first point of commonality. Another touch point for me is empathy. And there's no similarity here at all. Trump has shown a shocking lack of empathy for the victims of the coronavirus. We've had nearly 100,000 people die in about 100 days. In this past weekend, for instance, he spent Memorial Day weekend golfing and sending out all kinds of crazy tweets filled with all kinds of misstatements, to the point that Twitter today labeled two of his tweets as factually incorrect, and they put disclaimers on his tweets. Bill Clinton was a remarkably empathetic individual, and I want to share with you an example. I've got a video loaded up, and I have to find it. I want to play this clip for you. If I can find it, I'm going to pause the video so I can find the clip and share it with you. And the clip I'm about to share with you, part of it is a speech Clinton gave after the terrorist attack in Oklahoma, the bombing, if you recall, that killed 170 odd people. So I want to play just a couple minutes of this clip to give you a sense of the empathy that the man could and truly did have for others. So that was just a brief clip. Clinton was, I think, known for saying to people, "I feel your pain," and it's something that, again, if we're talking about viewing things through the filter of our current president, Donald Trump does not project any sense of empathy at all. A third touch point, when we talk about commonalities between the two presidencies, is hyperpartisanship. Trump benefits from it greatly. The Republicans support him in everything he does. The hyperpartisanship that we suffer from today actually came to be during the Clinton administration. And I want to talk about that in just a minute or two very briefly. So those three touch points, sexual predators, lack of empathy, hyperpartisanship, are common touch points, I think, between the two presidencies. What I want to do is talk about two very broad areas that brought very specific challenges to the Clinton White House, to the president himself and his running the country. And then, excuse me, with those in mind, we'll talk about his achievements and his legacy. So the first one to talk about clearly is the impeachment, the sexual issue. Monica Lewinsky affair led to the impeachment of Bill Clinton. And to review, we talked about this previously. Impeachment is a two-step process. The House of Representatives opens an investigation. They work sort of like a grand jury would. They investigate and see if there should be criminal charges filed against the president. And the constitutional definition is high crimes and misdemeanors, which is very broad. Only after the House votes articles of impeachment are the articles of impeachment sent to the Senate for a full trial. So if you recall, Richard Nixon resigned, but he was never impeached. The House was discussing and was preparing to vote on articles of impeachment, which would certainly have resulted in Nixon's conviction. It had bipartisan support, so Nixon resigned. Clinton was impeached on almost straight party lines. The Republicans voted for impeachment. Most of the Democrats voted against impeachment. But even those who voted against impeachment were very, very critical of the president's actions, his lack of good judgment, the immorality of having alliance in the Oval Office with the White House intern. He was acquitted on straight party vote, which is the case with Trump. Trump was impeached on a straight party vote. Democrats voting yes, Republicans voting no, and he was acquitted, straight party vote. So both men were impeached. The Clinton impeachment process dragged on longer than Trump's. The Democrats wanted to get it over before 2020 election cycle. The Republicans in the Clinton era to draw it out, but it was a distraction. And so I think you'll find scholars think or would put forward the notion that Clinton could have accomplished more in his second term of office without having the Lewinsky affair hovering over him. He did a lot of good things, but it was a lodestone. It weighed on his administration. I would point out, when we talk about impeachment and hypocrisy, Newt Gingrich, who was Speaker of the House when Clinton impeachment process started, resigned from office because he had not one. He was married to his first wife. He had an affair, and he informed her while she was very sick and in the hospital that he was leaving her and marrying his second wife. While he was married to his second wife, he had an affair with his current third wife. The gentleman who took over after Gingrich, Hassel, who's from Chicago. Now, of course, I knew his name and I've forgotten it. It's not important. But he's a man in his 70s. Excuse me, I'm going to pause you. I have to take this call. I apologize for that. So Dennis Hastert became Speaker of the House after Newt Gingrich. He soon thereafter also stepped down as Speaker of the House because he said he had a youthful indiscretion. He fathered a child out of wedlock. It was in his 70s when he made his announcement. The youthful indiscretion was when he was 42. So there's, as there always is in Washington, there was much hypocrisy, and the impeachment of Clinton was purely part of the hyperpartisanship that had developed during that era. Before we move on to this hyperpartisanship, I just want to take a minute or two and talk a little more about Paula Jones and some of the issues that went out. If you are internet savvy and you have a computer and you do some Google searches, in 2018 in the New York Times, there was an article called Paula Jones Reconsidered. It was November 2018. The article was by Amanda Hess, again, Paula Jones Reconsidered. And it took a look back at it. And it's worth thinking about to think about how much we have moved as a country. She did sue. Clinton did pay her civil damages, a large amount, hundreds of thousands of dollars, if I remember correctly. But she was trashed on TV, like Trump's accusers have been. And it's just, it seems to me Clinton would not have gotten away with what he did then today. And it's remarkable to me that Trump continues to get away with it. Other politicians, other business leaders have paid a harsh price for sexual harassment and inappropriate sexual behavior in the workplace. And it's a good thing that the standards have changed. We're still, I think, wrestling with it a bit. Some people, Harvey Weinstein comes to mind, he's in prison. Other people were accused and quickly drummed out of office, and maybe did have somewhat of a lynch mob feeling. And we're wrestling with where to draw the line. It's important that women's stories be heard, but it's important that they be credible stories. And so the other footnote I'll add to this, interestingly, Ken Starr was the special counsel who pursued Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky, during the Whitewater, Travelgate. They started so many gates. They went on and on and on and on investigating Clinton. Hillary Clinton had to turn over her billing hours from the law firms, all kinds of stuff. And Ken Starr was really a holier than thou figure. I think he was involved with the consulting and maybe on Trump's legal team during his impeachment. But it's worth pointing out that Ken Starr was president of Baylor University, and he lost his job as president in May of 2016. He then stepped down as chancellor because the university mishandled several cases in which football players were accused of attacking women. The coach lost his job. There were accusations that Starr, if he was involved in a cover-up, certainly looked the other way. He was president from 2010 through 2016. He knew what was going on. They did little to respond to accusations of sexual assault involving football players. So it's just, again, different circumstances, people take different positions. So Starr, who was out for blood with Clinton, sort of poo-pooed things when it came to his football program at Baylor University. Enough about the sexual accusations. The other big and the biggest challenge Clinton faced was the fact that in the midterm elections of 2014, the Republicans, for the first time in decades, took control of the entire Congress, not just the Senate, but the House. Driving that was something called the Contract with America. This is a legislative agenda. It was advocated for the Republican Party during the '94 congressional election campaign. It was written by Newt Gingrich and Dick Armey. They used some text from Reagan's 1985 State of the Union address. The contract detailed actions the Republicans promised to take if they became the majority party in the House. And what was interesting, I was reading one analysis, the impact of this, it turned state and local elections into a national election. It had people thinking about the Republican Party as a whole, as opposed to the person running for my state or my district. It was a huge thumping of the Democrats in '94. The Republicans gained 54 seats in the House. They gained 9 seats in the Senate. Gingrich became the House Majority Leader, and it really changed things. Now, I mentioned Gingrich, and again, if you are able to search the internet, there's a fabulous article in The Atlantic called "The Man Who Broke Politics." It's from November 2018, The Atlantic magazine. I want to read some excerpts from this so you can understand the extent to which Newt Gingrich is really the father of the partisanship that is ripping apart Washington and the country today, something he's proud of. And this partisanship complicated Clinton's presidency. In the end, Clinton was a far better politician than Gingrich. In the end, Clinton won a second term of office. He largely got his legislative agenda through, in part because even before the Lewinsky scheme, Gingrich had to step down. When Rabin was assassinated, and Clinton, who was close to Rabin, flew to Israel, many members of government went with him on Air Force One. When the plane landed back in Washington, Clinton, of course, came down the main door, and the other people went out the back door, including Gingrich. And Gingrich complained to the press about his treatment. He felt he was snubbed, that he had to go through the back door, and it really put him in a bad light. And it showed him to be sort of petty, and it compromised his standings. But I want to read the article, some quotes even before the '94 election. I'm scrolling through the article now to find the quote. This is even before he ran for office. This is from a speech he gave in June 1978. He was a faculty member at West Georgia College. He was a popular faculty member at West Georgia College. Here's what the article says. Gingrich had not come to deliver an academic lecture to the young activists. It was a group of young Republicans before him. He'd come to foment revolution. And this is what he said, one of the great problems we have in the Republican Party is that we don't encourage you to be nasty. We encourage you to be neat, obedient, and loyal, and faithful, and all those Boy Scout words, which would be great around the campfire, but are lousy in politics. For their party to succeed, Gingrich went on, the next generation of Republicans would have to learn to, quote unquote, raise hell, to stop being so, quote unquote, nice, to realize that politics was, above all, a cutthroat, quote unquote, war for power, and to start acting like it. Now, the speech received little attention at the time, but he laid out his manifesto then. And at that time, the Republican Party was at a very low point, arguably its lowest point in modern history. Many Republicans had lost their seats in the aftermath of Watergate. Those who survived, at least in Gingrich's eyes, were sadly resigned to a permanent minority mindset. This is what he said. It was like death, he recalls, of the mood of the caucus. They were morally and psychologically shattered. And I'm going to continue reading from the article. But Gingrich had a plan. The way he saw it, the Republicans would never be able to take back the House as long as they kept compromising with Democrats out of some high-minded civic desire to keep congressional business humming along. His strategy was to blow up the bipartisan coalitions that were essential to legislating and then seize on the resulting dysfunction to wage a populist crusade against the institution of Congress itself. His idea, says Norm Ornstein, a political scientist who knew Gingrich at the time, was to build toward a national election where people were so disgusted by Washington and the way it was operating that they would throw the ins out and bring the outs in. Right? Let that sink in. Throw the ins out and bring the outs in. A lot of people would argue that explains Trump's victory in 2016. The 12 congressmen that were part of this group that Gingrich called the Conservative Opportunity Society are described as follows. Their emergence was not at first greeted with enthusiasm by the more moderate Republican leadership. They were too noisy, too brash, too hostile to the old guard's cherished sense of decorum. They even looked different, sporting blow-dry pompadours, while their more camera-shy elders smeared Brill cream on their comb-overs. Gingrich and his cohort showed little interest in legislating, a task that had heretofore been seen as the primary responsibility of elected legislators. Bob Livingston, a Louisiana Republican who had been elected to Congress a year before Gingrich, marveled at the way the hard-charging Georgian rose to prominence by ignoring the traditional path taken by new lawmakers. My idea was to work within the committee structure, take care of my district, and just pay attention to the legislative process. But Newt came in as a revolutionary. One of the things Gingrich did, he realized that he could stand on the floor of Congress and give speeches to empty chambers and have it be broadcast on C-SPAN, right? Because C-SPAN doesn't show how many people are sitting in the seats in the House, they just show the speaker. So Gingrich would go on these tirades to an empty chamber, knowing that his remarks would be beamed to viewers across the country. It continues. As his profile grew, Gingrich took aim at moderates in his own party, calling Bob Dole, quote, the tax collector for the welfare state, and baited Democratic leaders with all manner of epithet and insult. Pro-communist, un-American, tyrannical. In 1984, one of his floor speeches prompted a red-faced eruption from Speaker Tip O'Neill, who said of Gingrich's attacks, it's the lowest thing I've ever seen in my 32 years of Congress. The episode landed them both on the nightly news, and Gingrich, knowing the score, declared victory. I am now a famous person, he gloated to the Washington Post. One last paragraph. It's hard to overstate just how radical these actions were at the time. Although Congress had been a volatile place during periods of American history with fistfights and canings and representatives bellowing violent threats at one another, by the middle of the 20th century, lawmakers had largely coalesced around a stabilizing set of norms and traditions. Entrenched committee chairs may have dabbled in petty corruption, and Democratic leaders may have pushed around the Republican minority when they were in a pinch, but as a rule, comity reigned. Most members still believed in the idea that the framers had minds, says Thomas Mann, a scholar who studies Congress. They believed in genuine deliberation and compromise, and they had institutional loyalty. There is no longer any genuine deliberation. There's no longer any compromise. There is no longer any institutional loyalty in the Congress. And I challenge anybody to, with a straight face, disagree with that statement. The current state of affairs in the Congress lies at the feet of Newt Gingrich. And this article says that Gingrich is quite proud of this. He thinks it was necessary. He thinks it's the only way to do things. It says as follows, right? He's the reporter who interviewed him in modern times for this article. He described Gingrich as gleeful. This is what Gingrich said to the reporter. The old order is dying. Almost everywhere you have freedom, you have a very deep discontent content with the system, that the system isn't working. And the reporter asked, is that a good thing? And Gingrich responded, it's essential if you want Western civilization to survive. So those two were the biggest challenges, those two things, the impeachment and the Lewinsky scandal, and the other gates that preceded the Lewinsky thing. They were found to be, you know, Congress chasing their tail. There was nothing there. They kept hoping they would find stuff on Clinton. Lewinsky gave them the stick to try and beat Clinton over the head. Again, they lost in the sense that his popularity went up. He would have won re-election. The hyper-partisanship, it didn't from being an effective president, as we'll see, but we very much are suffering the results of Gingrich and his cohorts taking over the Congress in '94. One last note on the Lewinsky scandal, and then we'll talk about Clinton's achievements and his legacy. Al Gore was very offended by Clinton's behavior, so much so that he really didn't let Clinton campaign for him in 2000. Bill Clinton was the most gifted politician of the modern era. Who's to say if Gore had let Clinton campaign for him that he couldn't have swung enough votes in key states where Gore would have won the 2000 election. It's not the only reason Gore lost. It's a very complicated election. If Ralph Nader doesn't run and it's a two-person race, most of the people who voted for Nader would have voted for Gore. Gore was a stiff campaigner, a lot of things, but excluding Clinton from the 2000 campaign hurt Al Gore. So let's, before I talk about Clinton's legacy, let me share with you another clip of Bill Clinton so that you can hear. This is a clip from one of his State of the Union addresses. Again, I'm going to pause it so I can cue up the video. Okay, let me, this is a short clip, a 4-minute clip from Bill Clinton's State of the Union address. I think it's 95. Here we go. It's a little ironic. Some of the things he spoke about, a president could be speaking about today in a State of the Union address. North Korea, flow of technology to Iran, preserving treaties with Russia, opening trade with China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let me now talk to you a bit about Clinton's achievements and his legacy. Now, where are those links? All right, I'm going to, you forgive me. I thought I had certain pages open. I'm pausing once again. I'll be sorry about that. I'm working on multiple computers and I had the articles open on one computer, not my laptop here. All right, let's talk about the Clinton legacy and his accomplishments. So when he delivered his first inaugural address, this was in January '93, he noted that the distinctions between domestic and foreign affairs were becoming blurred as the global population was affected by what he called a world economy, world environment, world AIDS crisis, and a world arms race. The international communication, the commerce, new technology, dominance of 24-hour news coverage, if they only knew what it would become, and the end of the Cold War were creating a new context for the U.S. and its government, and that required redefining the role of America and redefining its priorities both at home and abroad. As Clinton said at the Democratic National Convention '92, the urgent question of our time is whether we can make change our friend and not our enemy. So let's look at domestic affairs and then foreign affairs. And it's worth noting, many presidents are successful in one area and not the other. So for example, Lyndon Johnson was a brilliant president when it came to domestic affairs, and foreign affairs, he was saddled by Vietnam, destroyed his presidency, caused him not to run for re-election in '68, did great harm to America. Nixon, for all his domestic problems and Watergate, he had many accomplishments in foreign affairs, visiting China, making improvements with relation with China and the Soviets, aiding Israel during the Yom Kippur War in '73. So Clinton, I think we'll see, had greater success in domestic affairs than foreign affairs. So again, when he became president in '93, the U.S. economy was reeling from a second wave of recession following what was then an unprecedented stock collapse in the late '80s. We had the saving and loan crisis also in the late '80s, and so several bank failures, the oil price spike resulting from Iraq's 1990 invasion of Kuwait. U.S. poverty and crime rates were climbing. Clinton promised both job growth and reduction in national debt. As he said, we must do what America does best, offer more opportunity to all, and demand more responsibility from all. So his economic strategy focused on fiscal discipline, investment in education, healthcare, and technology, and opening foreign markets. Over strong Republican opposition, the Clinton administration passed budgets that combined tax increases on the wealthy with government spending cuts, achieving the largest budget surpluses and debt reduction in U.S. history by 2000. Clinton's last 2 years in office, the budget was in surplus, a surplus that George W. Bush quickly burned through by having massive tax cuts and then going to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Poverty levels fell. More than 20 million jobs were created. Unemployment rates consistently decreased over his 2 terms in office, reaching their lowest levels since the 1960s. With Republican support, he passed the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, in '93, which many thought was successful, except primarily for our current president, who wanted it thrown out and did throw it out, put something in place that's very similar to what it was. He removed trade barriers in North America, and he introduced a sweeping welfare reform bill in 1996 that required recipients to work and place lifetime limits on benefits, fulfilling his campaign promise to end welfare as we've come to know it. One of the criticisms of welfare is that people have a greater incentive not to work than to find work. So this reform put limits on things, and welfare, like I think unemployment ought to be a bridge, not a permanent fix to problems. Something that, given the huge unemployment rate right now, due to the COVID-19 outbreak, we're going to have to deal with. That's a topic perhaps for another day. Clinton also promised to end a ban on homosexuals in the military. It was a very controversial issue at the time. In the end, in '93, he satisfied nobody when he announced "Don't ask, don't tell" compromise. If you remember, at that time, if you were suspected or found being gay in the military, you were discharged. But the Clinton policy was, if you were outed, you could still be discharged, but the military couldn't ask. Don't ask, don't tell. So it was, maybe that's the beauty of it. When a compromise satisfies neither side fully, it's a real compromise. But he did what he could. A series of efforts to reduce crime included gun control and safety, notably the '93 Brady Law, enforcing background checks for handgun buyers and a ban on assault weapons. Joe Biden brags about that he was very involved with that. That was largely overturned by the 2008 Heller decision of the Supreme Court that said there's a self-standing constitutional right to gun ownership. Again, topic for another day, perhaps. Increased funding to improve community policing in '94. Programs to prevent youth crime and drug abuse. The overall crime rate fell during the Clinton administration to the lowest level in a generation. But let's step back. In hindsight, we see that the crime bills that they passed led to what people call mass incarceration. Our prison population has skyrocketed. It is disproportionately populated by young men of color, black and brown. It's a problem. There is a wonderful book written by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow. If you haven't read it and this topic interests you, you should read it. It's a brilliant work. Mass incarceration is a huge problem. Part of the outgrowth of the crime bill is policing efforts focused on where the crime was. So for instance, if you're policing areas trying to crack down on drug trade, right? So they focus on inner cities. And so you had lots of many young African-American men going to prison for possession charges of marijuana. Not necessarily, dealers are a different subject, but a lot of possession charges. I would say to you that if the police, instead of focusing on the inner cities, had focused on college campuses, our prisons would be filled with young white men, right? So part of the prison problem and the need for reform of our criminal justice system is where you focus your attention. If you only look at inner cities for drug deals and ignore all the drug deals, for instance, that go on college campuses, you end up putting a disproportionate percentage of black and brown people in prison. This will certainly get a lot of talk, maybe, but it should, during the campaign this year. If there is a campaign, Biden was involved with the crime bill. He has acknowledged his shortcomings. It'll be interesting. So getting back to Clinton, excuse me. Clinton also confronted acts of terrorism on U.S. soil, most notably when a car bomb was detonated in the center in 1993. We often forget that 9/11 was not the first attack on the World Trade Center. The attack in '93, I think, killed 6 people. And of course, you heard his clip from the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. That resulted in legislation that set new limits on habeas corpus intended to help deter domestic terrorism. Another area of priority for Clinton, the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993 provided job protection for workers needing to take a leave of absence for medical and family reasons. Intended to be Clinton's lasting legacy, sweeping health care reform proved beyond the reach of his administration. If you remember, he named Hillary Clinton to head up the committee to look into that. If you remember, they had all kinds of, there's a commercial at a couple questioning it. I mean, healthcare reform, Truman first tackled it. So the fact that it took to Obama's presidency to pass something, even that was a convoluted compromise, says a lot about what's going on. And again, topics for further discussion perhaps. This COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the weaknesses of our health system. I just read this week that some of the largest health providers in the country got billions of dollars in payouts from the congressional legislation passed last month. But you've got smaller hospitals around the country closing and laying off medical staff. It's crazy. My son-in-law works for a healthcare company. They're cutting staff. They've cut people's salaries. He was put on 4 days a week instead of 5 because they make most of their money on procedures and people doing elective procedures. Our healthcare system is a mess, and perhaps Bernie Sanders will be seen as being a prophet thanks to COVID-19. And we will certainly, in my humble opinion, end up, if the Democrats win in this year, we'll have some form of Medicare for all. I don't think it'll be mandatory, but we have to have some sort of national health plan because that piecemeal system we have is not working. Okay, enough on that rant. Clinton, while he failed to get major healthcare reform through, he had the state children's health insurance plan, which was a major expansion of publicly funded health insurance that allowed states to fund and cover uninsured children and low-income families. Field of education, Clinton backed the Federal Direct Loan Program in '93, providing low-interest college loans. He established a AmeriCorps program through which volunteers providing community service can earn education awards. During his administration, college enrollments increased to historically high levels. Net, he was a very successful, I think, domestic president, notwithstanding the harsh Republican partisanship thrown against him, notwithstanding Lewinsky and the impeachment. Let's look at foreign affairs. So obviously he was governor of Arkansas, so he had little experience in foreign affairs. In his inaugural address, he laid out a vision in which America would continue to lead the world and outline the beginnings of a new foreign policy in a post-Cold War era. He said as follows: when our vital interests are challenged or the will and the conscience of the international community is defied, we will act with peaceful diplomacy whenever possible, with force when necessary. This became known as the Clinton Doctrine. He accepted the importance of considering the consequences to our security of letting conflicts fester and spread. He said, we cannot, indeed, we should not do everything or be everywhere, but where our values and our interests are at stake and where we can make a difference, we must be prepared to do so. Now, this left him with some difficult choices. His doctrine was shaped, it was tested by a number of international conflicts, right? There were vivid images of those conflicts throughout the media. For instance, George H.W. Bush had initiated some intervention in Somalia to provide short-term security for humanitarian relief following a civil war and famine there. The conflict escalated after a mission was turned over to UN peacekeeping forces. There was a battle, if you recall, 18 U.S. soldiers were killed, a helicopter crash, 84 were wounded. The bodies of American soldiers were desecrated by Somalis. Clinton was ultimately forced to withdraw U.S. troops. So the intervention in Somalia was a strong cautionary example. So because of that, Clinton and the UN were reluctant, and they didn't intervene in another African civil war in Rwanda. Right? In hindsight, it was a huge mistake. 800,000 people were massacred in 6 months. Clinton regretted this. In 2006, he said it was among the worst decisions of his presidency. So sort of like a pendulum. Then you had the Balkan Peninsula was escalating to genocide as Bosnian Serbs were slaughtering Muslim men, women, and children. Reluctant to intervene at first, burned by Somalia, but I think with Rwanda haunting him, Clinton finally acted after international appeals for U.S. to take a leadership role. Clinton set up a NATO response plan, which quickly was triggered by a Serbian attack. NATO missions brought an end to the fighting, and within several months, Clinton presided over the Dayton Peace Accords, establishing himself as a competent and credible world leader. So, hard to know. After the Somali experience, you can't blame him for pulling out. But Rwanda was a terrible mistake. So we did intervene in Bosnia, but perhaps a little slower than we should have. International terrorism also escalated during his presidency. There was a deadly truck bombing outside a U.S. Military housing complex in Saudi Arabia. There were devastating explosions targeting U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya in '98. Suicide attack on the USS Cole in Yemen in 2000, all of which were linked to Al-Qaeda and its leader, Osama bin Laden. Clinton did order missile strikes on an Al-Qaeda affiliate in Sudan and on training camps in Afghanistan. I recall at the time there was talk, some people thought bin Laden was supposed to be there at the time. They missed him. If he was supposed to be there, clearly they missed. Clinton was criticized by some because there were those who said he was ordering these attacks to deflect attention from the Lewinsky affair. And bin Laden survived the attacks, but Clinton defended them, says they were in the best interest of U.S. national security. He advocated for strong international trade agreements that would open U.S. markets for exports. In addition to NAFTA, he pushed through GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, establishing in 1995 the World Trade Organization, an international group of member states responsible for monitoring trade rules among nations. He extended normal trade status to China. He supported China's admission to WTO. He lifted Vietnamese trade embargoes. He also, in this article, doesn't talk about it, but one of the things he was proud of, but again, when he listed disappointments, looking back in 2000, he brought the then Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, and Yasser Arafat to Camp David to try and hammer out a peace deal. Israel, according to reports, agreed to almost all the Palestinian conditions. If I had to put a percentage, Israel agreed to 95 or 98% of what Palestinians wanted. Palestinian state in the West Bank, East Jerusalem as the capital. There was going to be some physical connection between the West Bank and. But in the end, Arafat blinked. There are those who would argue that Arafat was either afraid to make peace. He looked at, in the 50s, the king of Jordan, Hussein, was murdered for being seen as being too cozy with Israel. Sadat was assassinated at peace with Israel. Or there are others who said that his self-persona, his self-identity as a freedom fighter was too strong for him to allow himself to be a peacemaker. And compare him to, for example, to Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years in prison and came out as just an unbelievable, remarkable example of a man of peace, saved South Africa. He could have put it on the path of civil war and destruction, and had Arafat followed or led Mandela with a similar example, the Middle East would be very, very different. I think Clinton did have some good successes in foreign affairs also. I think on the whole, more good than bad, but Somalia hangs over there. Rwanda is a big blot. Bosnia took time to bring an end to the fighting there. He couldn't get across the finish line in the Middle East. So if we were weighing things, many more domestic successes than foreign successes. So here's how this article, this analysis concludes. Although Clinton hoped to be a repairer of the breach, calling upon Congress in his second inaugural address to move beyond extreme partisanship and instead focus on America's mission, the ongoing investigations and scandals that plagued the second term and ultimately led to his impeachment would deny him that achievement. Reflecting on his administration, some will inevitably continue to question what else could have been accomplished, right? I think it's Clinton's administration, perhaps like Obama's second term, is a lot of what if. What if? What if Obama had not tried to get a bipartisan deal on health care and just rammed it through? Maybe it would have been a better system, okay, because the Republicans weren't going to give him anything at all. Nonetheless, Clinton's presidency is also remembered as one of the most successful of the 20th century, not only for its enormous domestic accomplishments and significant foreign policy achievements, but also for creating a stronger nation at the beginning of a new century. So let's end where we finished. There are some common touch points between Trump if we apply a Trump filter to Clinton presidency. But in total, there's very, very little similarities. Clinton was, he knew how to get things done. He knew how to compromise. He could outfox his opponents. You know, 96, Clinton clearly beat the Republicans at their own game. And you saw, I think, from the clip of his State of the Union address, there was still some camaraderie. You just think about the most recent State of the Union address here. Democrats didn't stand up. Pelosi tore up Trump's speech. Some of the harsh statements that Trump was hurling at people. The hyperpartisanship began during Clinton's time. It was a hindrance, but not to the levels that it is now. So, as historians, I don't know where. I didn't remember to look where historians rank Clinton. You know, it's still not so far away to have a unbiased look, but I think he will certainly, as it says, I think in the modern era, he was a very successful president. Certainly more successful than George W. Bush. More tangible accomplishments, for sure, and certainly more tangible accomplishments than Trump. He didn't redefine politics in the way Reagan did before him, but you know, he left America in good standing. As I said, 2 years of budget surpluses, people feeling good about things, the economy doing well, people feeling that the country was moving in the right direction. So, interesting to reflect back on these past presidents as we're in a election year, as we are trying to look at some of the current actions and statements and see how they stand up to those of his predecessors. So I think my next lesson I had in mind, I wanted to do a talk on some big meta questions in Judaism that are often posed but not often studied or discussed. I have some source materials I was thinking about to tackle the question, do we believe in heaven and hell? Something that interests me, if we were face to face, I'd get some feedback from you and you might say, great, sounds interesting, or oh no, please don't, but I'm on my porch by myself, so I get to kind of do what I want to do. So I think that will be my next lecture. I would encourage you, if you have suggestions or thoughts about what you'd like us to, I say talk about. We're not really talking about it, but hopefully sometime sooner than later, we will be able to sit around the table and talk about things. But if you have suggestions or ideas for topics, please share them with Amanda. Have her forward them to me. As always, if it's something I feel comfortable about discussing with you, I will. If it's something I don't know much about, I will try and research and see if I can get to a stage where I feel comfortable talking about it with you. So thank you for your time. Please, everyone, stay safe. We celebrate the holiday of Shavuot this coming Friday and Shabbat. Normally, we would all be in our synagogues and be up all night studying and celebrating this wonderful holiday. In my neighborhood, at least this week, synagogues slowly began to open. We've had outdoor services beginning last week, limited to 15 people standing at least 8 feet apart from each other with masks. It's pouring today. I don't think we'll have services tonight. It was a relief for me. As you know, I'm still in the mourning period for my mother, and I hadn't been able to say Kaddish for 2 months. And so it was relief to be able to get back into a regular routine with communal prayer. So be well, be safe, and I hope to be able to send a lecture to Amanda to share with you soon. Bye-bye.